Healing What Has Been Broken. Originally written by Harish Six. Recorded by Zayalis Saku. Chapter 1. Creation is life. That much Ink knew for certain. Yet for some reason, Error could not see or understand that. Error was a tall, glitching monster of a skeleton who would destroy all the multiverse if given the chance. Closing his eyes, Ink could picture him so clearly. Standing so much taller, scars all over him, glitching and multicolored, and a tattered black jacket and red sweater, glowing blue strings holding his clothes together. He obviously didn't have a care about looks. The lines going down from his sockets, blue that looked almost like tears, as if he was able to cry. His mismatched eyes glowed with power, and something that Ink had never really been able to place. Error looked so different from any other skeleton monster, let alone a Sans. He supposed it was a given. It showed just what Error really was. Error, the destroyer of universes, was a monster. When Ink had first woke in the Doodle Sphere, it had been amazing. His first memories were all blurred, but what he remembered most about that time was, after a while, he had gotten so lonely. He didn't know how he had gotten into the Doodle Sphere. Eventually, he knew he had to get out and find a home. After a bit of time and practice, he was able to come and go. He was able to create. It had taken a lot of time and magic and wondering, but eventually he made a portal. But after leaving the Doodle Sphere, Ink found the multiverse was not at all what he'd expected. There was only one universe, only one place to go. And he wasn't in its codes. As if Ink didn't even exist. There was nothing to let him know who he was, where he came from, if anyone was looking for him. He had no universe to call home. No friends waiting for him. No family, no lover, nothing. If nothing was waiting for him, he'd make something. He'd make a home. The first few universes had been experiments. He made them so unlike Undertale. Similar characters, but not at all the same plot. And for a good reason. He knew that they would be unstable. It was his first time using magic and manipulating the codes to create something as large as a universe. Of course the first few would be wonky. He didn't even expect the very first to make life at all. He was just like with drawing for the first time. Practice was needed. Eventually, he knew that the first few AUs would fade away. There was a huge chance that they would just stay barren forever. He didn't pay them any mind anymore. Soon he got into the groove of things. Universe after universe was made, stable and filled with life. And before Ink knew it, he had so many friends. Others who wanted to hang out with him, who looked up to him, loved him. Ink was no longer lonely. So he kept going, because the more friends the better. Eventually he started to make copies of those universes, little differences in between, to see what would happen, to make sure that those originals were never lonely like he had been. He didn't want anyone to be lonely like he had been. Then, Error came out of literal nowhere. At first he was loud, insane, very much in Ink's face. It was shocking, to say the least, as Ink was sure he'd never created such a monster. He could count on one hand the many monsters that he didn't create himself. Ink had yet to meet others, but Ink tried everything to make Error stop his destruction. Error called his creations wrong, abominations, death. Error truly hated creation, and it showed the reaction the glitching monster made. Ink tried everything to get him to stop, to make Error see what he was doing was wrong, Destruction only led to pain and death. Ink wasn't going to allow Error to just kill his creations, his friends. Over time, Error mellowed out in some ways, grew sharp in others, yet he was still so insane. With time, grew more scars, more pain, more fights, more death, more hatred. It was as if Error thought this was all a game, there was no end in sight. Did Error think he was some great big villain, and Ink was the one he must be once and for all? Or did Error, in his delusional mind, think he was really some kind of hero? What kind of game did Error think this was? With all these lives on the line, what did he want? But no, Ink knew the answer to that last question. All Error wanted was the death of all the AUs. That much was clear. Years had passed, decades, over a century at least, but Ink had lost count of the exact. This war between the two of them seemed to never end. Ink doesn't know what drives Error besides destruction for destruction's sake, but he knows he has to put a stop to it. It only got worse when those darker monsters banded together or teamed up. How they'd fallen so far Ink would never know. He may create their worlds, but their actions weren't his own. More and more problems kept piling after Error came in the picture. Ink had a feeling that more will just continue to come alive as long as Error breathed. There was one tiny part of Ink that did wish they could be friends, that didn't need to fight, that they could just hang out without pain, and maybe even more if given the chance. There was so much Error could be, so much good he could do with his power if he weren't such a monster. There was something that caught Ink's attention, and at least he didn't like to admit to. But Ink wasn't blind. With how Error was, there was no chance of that happening. Opening his eyes, Ink looked at the barren, dust-filled AU. He had saved the universe itself from being destroyed, but he came too late for the inhabitants. Leaning down, Ink lifted some of the dust into his hands, tears coming out of glaring sockets. Is this all just a game to you? Creation is destruction. Destruction is creation. One cannot exist without the other. To create, you must destroy what is already there. To destroy, there must be a creation to be destroyed. It is impossible to make something out of nothing. You take other items, you destroy what they are, and you make something new out of them. You cannot destroy nothing. You have to take creation and destroy it, and leave room in the space that creation was. They were two halves of a whole, yin and yang. They were a balance. Separate, they were only instability. That much Error knew was certain. For some reason, Ink couldn't see or understand that. At the start, Error would admit he didn't care about the balance of the multiverse he'd been forced to live in. At the time, he was just too angry to care about anything but his vengeance. He had been trapped in that endless white for so long, the voices screaming at him, overtaking his mind, his bones morphed and twisted. That place, his jail, messed with his head and emotions. Calling for help did nothing but make the voices grow louder in their laughter. There was one point where he purposefully made himself bleed just to give the white some color. His first attempt at suicide, hanging by his own strings, had been soon after that. Dark blue strings hung off his soul and pulled it back together where it had broken. Dark blue, in terms of the soul, was stability and emotionlessness. That was how Error found out not even death wanted him, that he was stuck in some endless loop. That may have been when insanity truly took him, now that he thinks about it. What is now called the anti-void is not something he'd wish on anyone. Well, perhaps fate. Fate, who calls himself a god, the one who says that this is his fate, and there is no way out no matter what he does. Fate has deemed this his life, his fate, and he's come to curse the word because of it. At the start, after getting out of the anti-void, error in his tortured mind let his need for vengeance and justice take over everything in him. It drove him to destroy everything that was not the original Undertale. In the back of his mind, he had thought that if he did, then he wouldn't have to destroy anything again, or at least not be forced to. He might want to destroy something he wanted, but not have someone point and make him, not to have to kill children and newborns. But back then, none of that mattered. What mattered was fighting, destroying all that stood in his way. And then in came Ink, Fate's one and only true child. And if Ink was Fate's true child, Error was the unwanted adoption Fate had stolen out of malicious intent. Because while Error didn't really recall his past, he knew that if Fate did not need him, he wouldn't be in the position he was in now. Ink, who stood just to Error's hips, was someone Error wanted to strangle, to scream at, to just ask why. A small creator made universes. That was his job, and really he seemed to love it. But he went too far. And then he had the gall to try and stop Error from doing what he needed to do. Sure, at the start, Error had wanted it all gone, but as time went on and he'd lost his anger, well, never his insanity, not completely, but his anger had faded as a thirl grew in his soul. The light sky blue trickled into him, contrasting the yellows it was made. By the time almost all the multiverse hated him, Ink, the one who they saw as a savior or a god, hated him. So everyone follows the leader. No matter how many times Error tried to explain this was his job, this was something he had to do, too many universes was a bad thing, no one believed him. Only those who were already rather dark ever stayed by his side. Sure, Nightmare poisoned him fairly often, or chewed on him when his hunger pangs were too bad, and Dust loved to try to kill him, but they were his. The same with Cross, who was always so funny, and Killer, who loved to listen to his stories, and the Charas and Friss, who were blamed and used as scapegoats like he was, where the human blames all their sins on them, as if they were the ones who decided to go on a killing spree just because. They were the consequences to the humans' actions. But of course, who would believe that? The world around them shapes them, gives reasons to actions. Yet no one can understand. The judge is always blind. Everyone is blind. There was Swap, too. But after kidnapping him and letting him go, Stretch had made sure that he was not welcome in Underswap anymore. And it was better he stay away, for Swap's own good. Error was too dark for someone so bright. He'd taint the other. Better to stick to those already similar to him, even if he rarely sees them for his job. Who else would love a monster but other monsters? Better to stick together in a multiverse that would deny the obvious and be so detrimental to things they did not understand. He supposed they took their hypocrisy from Ink. The monster who was abandoned by Ink for what they are. It was hilarious and terribly hypocritical. Ink had created their universes, created them to be what they are. He may have done it vaguely, but he made them what they are today. Without his anger, with only a sense of justice to keep him going, it became for the balance, for the multiverse. There was only So much he could take. Only so much anyone could take. It had been decades. So many years he lost count. Years of fighting, of pain, of silent cries for help that go unanswered when his vocal cries were only laughed at. He was beyond the point of giving up. He's only holding up by a fried thread, and no one can see it. Ink, the creator, was going to kill them all. Even when he was lost to anger, Error never made a dent in all Ink's creation. If the universe's touch, everything was going to crumble. There's only so much space, even in a multiverse, and Ink was eating it. With no space to grow, they would touch and die. And for some reason, fate would not pull back on Ink. For some reason, he would not stop. It was like Ink wanted them all dead. Maybe they just wanted Error to suffer. Or maybe it was just a game, where Ink was a grand hero, and Error forever the villain he had to beat. Was Ink truly so conceited? Or did he think the whole multiverse was his sandbox and all the lies in it his toys like fate does? Sitting in the endless white, Error looked down at the doll that looked so much like Ink in his hands. Could picture him perfectly to make it, standing about to Error's hips, his ever-changing eyes always a glare, paint-stained white sweater and brown pants, a long blue scarf with a strap of paints, fake emotions across his chest, and that huge paintbrush always strapped to his back when it wasn't flying for Error's head. He looked as non-threatening as possible, with his bright, colorful stains and small stature. Error wasn't blind. Ink was the most threatening monster there was. For fate favored him, for he, as the creator, had no limits, and would accept no consequences for his actions. No sins would ever crawl up his back, for he wouldn't feel them. Ink was the most dangerous, because he was slowly killing the multiverse one world at a time, and everyone loved him despite it. Opening his eyes, Error looked down at the doll in his hand once more. Is this all just a game to you?